Hi. It is so exciting to be here in person. I'm regularly one of the people here on Zoom, and it's so wonderful to be here in the room with you. The first thing I ever shoplifted was broccoli. I was 15. I was just coming off a stretch of being homeless, and I had recently entered foster care. My foster mother was having some struggles of her own at the time, and there was no food in the house for me or my foster sisters. I had reasoned through the morality of shoplifting in this situation. A fair society feeds its children. I had a right to take matters into my own hands, that sort of thing. I'd shored up my courage by humming tunes from Les Miserables on the way to the grocery store. But to be on the safe side, I had to steal the most moral thing that I could think of, which was broccoli. I don't recommend broccoli as a first shoplifting caper. It does have the advantage of being found in the vegetable section, which is not too carefully watched for shoplifters. But it's large, it's kind of like grippy when you try and slide it under your coat. But I did pull it off. And then I ran home with it tucked under there, high on adrenaline and this pride, and I was only a kid myself, and I was feeding my sisters. I unloaded my bounty onto the kitchen table with a triumphant thud, and my younger sister stared at me, and then she stared at the broccoli, and she said, "I'm not eating that, it's gross." The worst thing about shoplifting broccoli is that you are morally obligated to make sure that it does not go to waste. A whole head of broccoli, raw, is a lot of broccoli. The next time, I stole icing. That went over better. There were fewer leftovers. Then I stole some clothes I needed. And then I stole some clothes I wanted. And then I stole a Vanilla Ice CD, which I have trouble justifying on several levels. Pretty soon, I was stealing a lot. I had gone from doing what was necessary to just being a thief. Until the day that I stopped. I remember that day just as vividly. I was standing in that same store, chocolate icing in my hand. I was in a different foster home at this point, a new one. I'd been there for a couple of months. It was headed by a single dad named Ed. Ed went to work and came home, cooked supper, read mystery novels on the couch, and went to bed. There was always food. There was never any drama. I think at the time I thought it was a little bit boring, if I remember. But looking back, I know that Ed saved my life. And so I was standing in the grocery aisle, staring down at the chocolate icing in my hand, and I was thinking about what Ed's face would look like if I got caught. Because Ed didn't know I was a thief. He expected more of me. So I put the icing back, and I walked out, and I never stole again. From there, the story looks a lot like a pull yourself up by the bootstraps narrative. I stopped stealing. I stopped a whole host of difficult behaviors. I got my grades up. I got through high school and earned my BA. I ended up married to a doctor living a very respectable stay-at-home mom church lady life, unless you look too closely at the church. When I tell this story in a UU context, people are always so kind. They are quick to reassure me that I have nothing to be ashamed of, and they tell me I had no choice but to steal. But that's not true. I didn't just steal food. I stole clothes so I could look like my peers. I stole CDs so I could lie on the grass with my eyes closed and listen to music. Even that food that got me started in the beginning. Saskatchewan has food banks and soup kitchens. Stealing was not my only way to eat. I did have limited choices, but within those limits, I could have done better. In university, I got a chance to study the root causes of crime. I had always thought of crime as something that came from individual decisions because I remembered making those decisions. But research shows that groups act in fairly predictable ways in response to their context. Yes, I didn't make perfect choices, but it turns out that making imperfect choices is something people do all the time, not just people with limited money. And if you want to change a crime rate, you don't lecture people about being moral, you don't even punish them more, you change the context that they're living in. I wasn't a bad person when I stole things. I was a person whose situation had overwhelmed her and who was having trouble thinking clearly. I stole because I was so deeply hungry, physically and emotionally. And when I wasn't, I stopped. Fast forward to my 30s, to my doctor's wife, mother church lady years. I was working on a campaign aimed at getting the government of Saskatchewan to implement a poverty reduction plan. We chose the campaign title Poverty Costs because we were trying to get across the point that it's actually not frugal to allow people to suffer. Things like hospital stays, police involvement, homeless shelters. There's pretty good math that shows that paying people's rent is cheaper than the alternative. We chose this somewhat sociopathic sounding angle because it's true and it's a good argument, and for us it was good strategy. We were working with a conservative government. I don't know how it is here, but in Canada, telling a conservative government that they are at risk of losing the Unitarian Universalist vote is not so effective. Conservative politicians don't usually see us as one of their key voting blocs. We can't just convince the usual suspects, a teammate said, summarizing the reason for our strategy. We need to reach people who are oriented towards money more than compassion, like the ones who live in penthouses. I live in a penthouse, I said. My friend knew this. He had been to my house. We had had meetings of this committee in my house. I didn't mean you, he stammered. I meant like people who live in penthouses. It's okay, I grinned, and we laughed because it was pretty funny. But that night I couldn't sleep. I know in my bones what it's like to have no home at all. And what business did I have taking more house than I needed? When the boys' dad and I separated a few years later, it was not immediately clear what was going to happen with the finances. And so on instinct, I moved into a tiny apartment. Each boy had a bedroom, and I slept in the living room, and I spent very carefully. I had a book called Your Money or Your Life, and I went through the process it outlines, which is fun and life-changing. And over time, I learned to feel what the authors call your point of enough. It was hard to recognize at first because we're not taught that a point of enough is even possible, sort of like recognizing a unicorn. But over time, I felt my ability to sense it thawing, like a frozen limb. By the end of that year, our divorce was finalized and I had more to spend. And now it was time for me to start making some financial decisions. I realized I had fallen in love with the lifestyle of enough. I loved my cozy little apartment. I loved Squeaky, my very old minivan that didn't matter if you scratched it. I loved beans and rice and board games in the evenings. I realized I had everything that I needed in a life that fit me, that felt like this share of things is for me the right size. I am not romanticizing poverty here. Religion can sometimes lean that way, with nuns and monks and vows of poverty and so on. A vow of enough is a different thing. I had savings, I had security, I had money for the things that mattered to me. And so I set a generous threshold and I committed to giving away everything beyond that amount. This turned out to be shockingly comfortable. It was quite delightful, actually. Even from a totally selfish perspective, the joy of watching what gets built with that money is the funnest thing that I can buy with it. After living this way for a few months, I couldn't believe I had ever lived differently, and I kept thinking about all the people who could have been helped if I had figured this out sooner. I shouldn't have waited for a divorce to start living a life that was more in line with my values. This new set of regrets was a lot harder to work through for me than the stealing was. Because it's harder to forgive yourself for the choices you make when you're the one with the power, when you are not too hungry to think. Feeling stuck in a system you don't agree with and trying to figure out how to push back, it's really hard. It's a different kind of hard than poverty. I found it to be quite a bit of an easier kind of hard than poverty, but it was still hard. At this point, I had long since made peace with my history of stealing, but now I had a whole process again with a different set of decisions that I'd made, but I did ultimately make that peace. And so today, if I could speak to 15-year-old me who was stealing or 35-year-old me in the penthouse, I would tell those versions of myself both the exact same thing. First, I would tell them that they have more choices than they realize. 15-year-old me could have gone to a food bank or a soup kitchen. 35-year-old me could have participated in the financial decisions of our household differently. We have more freedom than we realize, and going forward in my life now, I want to recognize that freedom and use it. I also want to forgive myself the times that I don't. The second thing I would say to 15-year-old Liz and 35-year-old Liz is that you are not a bad person every time you fail to push back. Systems exert pressure. No matter which place in the system you find yourself in, your choices are not going to be perfect. I don't know which choices feel most alive to you in your life right now, and I don't know what you are struggling with. But if you felt a welling of forgiveness towards me for doing what I had to do when I was a kid, I invite you to tap into that same well for yourself with the choices that you are facing, particularly this month. 'Tis the season, after all, of unrealistic expectations, financial and otherwise. I hope you will have enough this season, in every way. I hope you will get to be a part of as many holidays activities as you are excited to go to, and not a single one more. I hope if you give gifts, you will have enough to give as many as are truly meaningful for everyone involved, and not a single one more. I hope that you will have time with all the relatives that you want, and not a single evening more. I hope you will seek out and get the things that bring you joy, and that you will feel free to draw the boundaries where you need them to be. I hope you will give yourself permission to make choices this season that are in line with what you value. Of course, I hope this at the same time as knowing it's not going to totally work out that way. We live in the real world. There will be compromises. I hope you navigate those choices in a way that will bring you peace. And if you don't quite pull that off, I really hope you will cut yourself some slack. Maybe you will make financial decisions this month you aren't happy about. Maybe you'll manage your time less perfectly than you could. Maybe you will let Uncle Herbert push all your buttons over family dinner, and the calm, self-differentiated response you had planned will dissolve into a wild mess of rage tears. If any of these things happen, be gentle with yourself. Remember, people are products of their contexts, and you are a people. Sometimes you are just too physically or emotionally hungry, and you take the simplest route to what you need. And that's fine. Making choices you don't always love is part of the path of making it to choices that are right to you. The next chance to get it right is just around the corner. In the meantime, be kind to yourself. Not just a little kindness either, generous helpings of gentleness and grace and self-compassion, because that is how much it will take. This season, I wish you enough.